on a committee that conducted the oral examination of a graduate student named Janet Yellen. In 1972, he left academia and joined the Board of Governors within 5 years. He rose to the head of the Division of International Finance. At the board, Truman was regarded as a brilliant but temperamental figure who thought he was a guardian of the gate. One former governor recalled, "Governors were political types who came and went, and he was the protector of the institution, and he knew what was best." By the time Greenspan arrived in 1987, Truman's status was as a keeper of the Fed's international portfolio was established, a position Greenspan defended through a number of challenges. According to contemporaneous accounts for international meetings that Greenspan could not attend, Truman would go in his place. Only the vice chair would be an exception to that rule. A presidential appointed Senate confirmed Fed governor could not. Interestingly, it was a question of economic expertise that prevented governors from taking a more robust role in the international affairs. For example, Bill Clinton considered appointing Peter Kennan, an internationally renowned monetary economist, to the Fed's board. Before Kennan would accept the position, he consulted with Greenspan and asked if Kennan would be able to play a policy role in international affairs. Greenspan said no. "I was told that the representational role of the board in international matters were his and the vice chairman Truman's," Kennan recalled. "I could not expect to attend many international meetings on behalf of the board." Greenspan and Truman would also handle the more politically sensitive role of close coordination of the international economic policy with the U.S. Treasury. The governors had no role to play there. Truman's work then was not merely the technocratic function of crunching numbers and shaping models. Where the staff economists exercised their influence, Kennan was qualified for that job too. It was in the inherently political and diplomatic functions as well. This was despite the fact that Kennan would have been the U.S. President's representative, usually the only qualification necessary to engage on the government's behalf on high-level policy issues. No period of international economic history demonstrates Truman's influence more than financial crisis in Mexico and the southern East Asia in the 1990s. During the Mexican crisis, called by some the first crisis of the 21st century, many that Mexico's default on public debt would not only wreak havoc on its own economy, but also affect its major trading partners, including the United States. The Clinton administration, led by Secretary of the Treasury Robert Rubin, wanted to avoid a Mexican default and sought authorization from Congress to attend a $40 billion loan, a bailout of the peso. Congress balked and refused to budge. Clinton's team at the Treasury, including under the Secretary of the Treasury, Larry Summers, the Assistant Secretary, Jeffrey Schaefer, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Monetary and Financial Policy, Timothy Geithner, sought to figure out a way to use authority already granted them to stave the crisis off. The best they could do was use what is called Exchange Stabilization Fund, a pot of money given to the Treasury to influence exchange rates without tapping directly into the central bank's money supply. But even the Exchange Stabilization Fund, ESF, wasn't good enough to provide the Mexicans needed. The Clinton administration's efforts to secure congressional support for more funds failed. Here is where Truman came in. He engineered a way for the Treasury and Fed to join forces to expand the reach of the ESF. Mexico could exchange pesos for dollars through an international swap facility, a structure the Fed had used before between the Fed and the Bank of Mexico, an enduring policy move that had implications for the way the Fed would handle the financial crisis of 2008. Through the swap facility, Mexico could access dollars from the Federal Reserve that it could not secure in private markets, or at least not such as favorable rates. Truman's policy innovation had allowed the Clinton Treasury and the Fed to overcome the lack of congressional authorization. The financial crisis following soon thereafter in Southeast Asia saw Truman's similar participation in policy and diplomatic role. As the currency's financial system and economies of the developing Asian countries, such as Indonesia and Thailand, began to teeter, they threatened to bring down the rest of the region. The Clinton Treasury and the Federal Reserve sprang into action, with much of the work of selling their plans to the governments, including heads of the states, the affected countries, falling to Timothy Geithner. At the time, Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Monetary and Financial Policy, and again Truman, they met with foreign politicians, finance ministers, and central bankers to sell their plans for financial stability. It was a high-stakes economic diplomacy, and not an exaggeration to say that Truman acted on the country's behalf as one of the chief diplomats. His job titles during these talks stayed the same: Staff Economics, the FOMC, the Director of the Board, Federal Governors, Division of International Finance. Their efforts paid off. First Mexico and then Asian economies were spared. Time magazine feted Reuben Summers and Greenspan as the Committee to Save the World. While the Time article didn't go into detail about Truman's contributions, it should have. Much of the policy making, the diplomacy went into these frenzied months and years came from by him. By all accounts, although some protested his temper, Truman represented the best thinking on the international financial crisis within the United States. Truman's role with the Fed was certainly technocratic. His understanding of the international monetary cooperation was considered unparalleled within the Fed. He drew on the expertise throughout the crisis, but it was also high diplomatic. It is also important that his counterparts elsewhere in the government were all political appointees, including future Secretary of the Treasury Geithner. Their task wasn't writing the policies or writing the rules to support them. It was an act of politics, diplomacy, and judgment, reflecting the value judgments about how the U.S. interests should be represented. To the government officials throughout the world, and yet Truman was, of course, staff economist. The idea then that the work of the Federal Reserve is pure technocracy, the domain of mathematical economists solving proofs, is grossly inaccurate. Staff economist. Truman's globe-trotting adventures fighting international financial crises is an unusual example of staff economists' influence on the political process. More often, but not less important, staff economists and their division heads also wield important policy authority inside the Federal Reserve Building and in Washington, and in each of the 12 federal reserve banks. The Federal Reserve System employs hundreds of such economists to play a core policy-making role. Their roles are largely to serve three research functions: macroeconomic analysis, discerning what is happening in the economy; economic forecasting, discerning what will happen in the economy; and relatedly, their own academic research. This work requires both technical expertise and also a feel for public policy. The work of monetary policy, financial stability, and everything else that goes on within the Fed is primarily the work of academic economists. For this reason, one Federal Reserve Bank president concluded that for economists, university and Fed jobs are not all different in terms of their role of independent research. Economists clearly dominate the scene at the Fed at all levels of bureaucracy. It wasn't always so. While economists have always played an important role in determining the scope of the Fed's power and institutional form, the Fed used to be more dominated by bankers and lesser extent lawyers. At the end of William McChesney Martin's treasurer at the Fed, for example, the former banker let slip that he would dispense with the kind of analysis presented by the Fed's growing army economic forecasters. Martin was swimming against the tide. Economists have grown in importance at all levels of the Fed, including the top. At the top, indeed, being an economist seems to be something of a prerequisite for the Fed chair. not because the chair needs to be running regressions and modeling the economy herself. It is that the Fed's chair has to be able to evaluate the work of the staff economists. Without a PhD in economics, according to one former governor, the Fed staff will run technical rings around you. And while bankers still dominate the boards of the regional Federal Reserve banks, their influence as staffers and members of the board of governors was waned over time. Wizarded over time. The rise of the Fed's economists matters for another reason beyond the control of the Fed's governors or even chair. The staff economists use their authority to make hiring decisions, plan economic conferences, publish scholarships, and even make else we associate with the production of knowledge in universities. And because the Fed hires so many economists, hosts many more in its conferences, and otherwise influence the nature's tenor of economic debate. What the Fed does in producing economic knowledge matters enormously. Except in the Fed isn't a university, the apparatus of knowledge production that occurs in universities, tenor, review, outside publication requirements, public engagement, the airing of different conflicting ideas, and does not exist in the same way at the Federal Reserve. Of course, universities are far from perfect places, with compromises on some of the same principles. At the Fed, though, there's simply no way of knowing exactly what the knowledge production function works with certainty, while Fed economists actively engage with others in the academy. How the Fed makes hiring decisions, plans conferences, or otherwise engages academic outsiders is too opaque to evaluate its objectivity. Hit the obliques, abdomen. From the Fed's perspective, there is a good reason for this opacity. The Fed has a horse in the race for producing economic ideas about its policy mission. Like members of any other institution, those